Okay, let's start with this image. A major romantic poet, dead at just 29, a chaotic shipwreck off the Italian coast.
Right.
I mean, his whole life was this state of intellectual and personal explosion. But the image that really, truly gets you is what happened after he died.
The cremation.
The cremation on the beach.
Right.
The heat, the flames, and this human heart that just famously refused to burn.
And you know what's so fascinating is that this one physical event, whether it really was his heart or maybe his liver calcified, we don't know for sure, it becomes the perfect symbol for the man himself.
How so?
It just mirrors the intense, fiery, and completely resistant nature of his entire intellectual life. So today we are diving deep into Percy Bysshe Shelley.
And not just as the author of, Ozymandias or Ode to the West Wind, which you probably read in school.
Exactly. We're looking at him as one of the most politically charged, skeptical, and honestly genuinely radical intellectuals of his entire era.
Absolutely. Our mission for this deep dive is to give you a real shortcut to understanding the ultimate nonconformist. You'll see why his short life was this perpetual series of crises, self-exiles, and these intellectual explosions that led to some of the most enduring and politically urgent poetry of the entire Romantic period.
And that influence, it doesn't just stay in literature.
No.
Shelley's worldview, his ideas, they directly inspired foundational figures who are just worlds apart. You're talking about Karl Marx,
Right, the father of communism.
George Bernard Shaw, the playwright and socialist,
Yeah.
and maybe most importantly, Mahatma Gandhi.
The father of modern nonviolent resistance.
Exactly. So to really understand the depth of his art, you absolutely have to trace the ferocity of his rebellion.
So let's start right at the beginning. How does a boy born into the absolute heart of the English establishment, how does he transform himself into the country's most feared radical?
It all begins with just immense privilege. I mean, total expectation. Shelley was born August 4, 1792, at Field Place in Sussex. He's the eldest son of Sir Timothy Shelley.
A member of Parliament.
Right, a member of Parliament, yes. And for you listening, it's important to know what kind. Sir Timothy was a Whig.
Okay, let's pause there for a second, because this is the turn of the 19th century. What does being a Whig MP actually mean for Shelley's background?
It's a really crucial piece of context. So the Whigs, they weren't the Tories. They were generally the more liberal reformist party.
Right.
They favored constitutional monarchy. They supported Catholic emancipation. They kind of represented this rising professional class, a more progressive view of government.
So he was born into a family that, while definitely aristocratic, was already leaning toward a certain amount of intellectual freedom.
Exactly. So he wasn't rebelling against some rigid, ultra-conservative dogma. He was rebelling against moderate reform in favor of absolute revolution.
And his early childhood was, by all accounts, pretty sheltered, pretty happy. He was close to his mother, his 4 younger sisters. He had this brilliant mind right from the start.
Oh, an incredible memory, a gift for languages, a real thirst for knowledge. The path was laid out for him. Inherit the baronetcy, continue his father's political career. Simple.
But that path to the establishment gets instantly derailed by the establishment.
Yes. The moment he's sent off to school, first to Sion House Academy and then, crucially, to Eton College in 1804, his nonconformity it surfaces violently. He hated it. He later called it a period of absolute loathing.
And this wasn't just, a kid being miserable at boarding school. He was subjected to severe, organized mob bullying.
They had a name for it.
Shelley Bates. It was a ritual. What was it about him? What made him such a specific target?
It was his entire nature, really.
Yeah.
And his principled refusal to conform to the school's brutal social hierarchy. Biographers point to his aloofness, his general air of being different. But the big one was his refusal to participate in fagging.
And for anyone not familiar with the term fagging it's not just doing chores.
No. It was a deeply entrenched, often brutal system of servitude. The older, more powerful students imposed it on the younger boys. It was mandatory, often humiliating personal service.
It's a form of tyranny.
A microcosm of it, yes. For Shelley, this fiercely independent, idealistic mind, it was an intolerable oppression. And his refusal wasn't laziness. It was a radical political act of resistance, even as a teenager.
The result of all this pressure, his peers just branded him Mad Shelley.
And he was. He was prone to these sudden, violent rages that were apparently terrifying to his schoolmates. He started having nightmares, hallucinations, sleepwalking.
Symptoms of real psychological distress that would follow him, really, for the rest of his life.
And these eccentricities were just fueled by this deep, intense interest in science and the occult. This wasn't just passive reading for him.
No, it was action. He would subject his sisters to these terrifying experiments during the holidays.
Right? With gunpowder, acids, electricity. There are accounts of him blowing up a paling fence at school, trying to raise spirits with occult rituals at Eton. He was chasing forbidden knowledge with this terrifying energy.
But it wasn't all just explosions and ghosts. His radicalism was also being nurtured intellectually.
Yes, in his senior years at Eton, a part-time teacher, a man named James Lind, he really encouraged this curiosity. He introduced Shelley not just to the occult, but to genuinely liberal and radical Enlightenment authors.
And that led him to start studying Plato, idealist philosophy, on his own.
So by the time he gets to University College, Oxford, in October 1810, he's already a published, if unconventional, literary figure.
Right, he'd already published a Gothic novel, Testrozi.
A collaboration of poetry with his sister, and another Gothic novel, St. Irvine. He arrives at Oxford already armed with a sharp pen and a very volatile mind.
And once he's there, the traditional academic structure just holds zero interest for him.
None whatsoever. He skipped most lectures. He preferred to spend hours reading on his own and, of course, dedicating himself to those volatile scientific experiments he set up right there in his college room.
And his political views just crystallized under the influence of his closest friend, Thomas Jefferson Hogg.
Hogg was another sharp, rebellious mind, and together they quickly developed these genuinely dangerous, anti-Christian, and subversive political ideas. Ideas, we should note, that his father had specifically warned him against.
Sir Timothy knew his son was a bit of a firebrand, but he completely underestimated the depth of his atheistic convictions.
Which led directly to his downfall. In the winter of 1810-1811, he and Hogg, they co-author and privately publish a pamphlet that, it left nothing to the imagination.
The Necessity of Atheism.
And this is where Shelley proves he's more than just a thinker. He's an agitator. He doesn't hide it. He escalates the confrontation.
How?
He ensures the message gets out. He mails copies directly to every single bishop and every head of college at Oxford. He literally forced the institution's hand.
That is just guaranteed to cause a confrontation, isn't it? He was called before the college fellows and the dean. What exactly went down in that meeting?
They asked him directly, "Did you write this?" And his downfall wasn't based on the content of the pamphlet itself. Not really. It was based on his refusal to acknowledge their authority.
So he stood on principle.
Absolute intellectual freedom. He refused to confirm or deny authorship, and that refusal, that unforgivable act of nonconformity to the college authorities, was grounds for immediate dismissal. On March 25, 1811, both he and Hogg were expelled.
So he didn't actually lose his place because he was an atheist. He lost it because he refused to answer a question.
Exactly. It was a rejection of the institution's right to demand obedience and confession from him. And this decision, the expulsion, that was the point of no return with his family.
So Timothy was furious.
Furious. He threatened to cut off all contact unless Shelley came home, submitted, and agreed to study under tutors the family chose. Shelley's refusal was instantaneous. He chose intellectual honesty and his radical beliefs over his birthright and his financial security.
So this brings us to a really crucial phase. He's cut off from his family, cut off from his entire expected future, and he has to immediately start living this radical philosophical life he'd been talking about.
And instead of some kind of utopia, he finds just chaos.
Yeah, and it began almost immediately with his spontaneous marriage to Harriet Westbrook.
Just months after his expulsion, August 1811, he impulsively elopes to Scotland with a 16-year-old Harriet. Which is just, it's astonishing when you remember that, philosophically, Shelley was fundamentally against the institution of marriage.
He saw it as tyranny, right? As a property exchange.
Yes. So why on earth does he go get a marriage certificate?
It seems like a massive contradiction right out of the gate. Was it just societal pressure? Trying to protect her reputation?
Probably a combination of youthful impulse and, yes, a desire to protect Harriet's reputation, but it just reveals this inherent difficulty in translating radical philosophy into real-world action.
And the consequences were immediate.
And entirely predictable. Both his father and Harriet's father, a man named John Westbrook, they cut off their allowances.
And Shelley's father viewed the match as a total disaster, didn't he?
Oh, completely. Sir Timothy felt his son had married entirely beneath him. Harriet's father was a prosperous butcher, a tavern and coffee house owner.
He was in trade, not gentry.
Exactly. And this just compounded Shelley's social isolation. Now, he wasn't just a radical, he was a pauper who had married into the wrong class.
They're relying heavily on borrowed money, and almost instantly they try to create this first chaotic experiment in communal living.
He invites his dearest friend, Thomas Jefferson Hogg, to live with them. Then Harriet's older sister, Eliza, moves in as well. I mean, you can just feel the emotional tinderbox being built.
It sounds like an absolute powder keg. This attempt to live out his ideals of free love, where intellectual friendships are supposed to trump traditional marriage boundaries, it failed pretty quickly.
Almost instantly. The whole experiment just fractures dramatically when Hogg attempts to seduce Harriet while Shelley is away trying to get money from his father.
Okay, now, a conventional husband would be livid.
Yeah.
He'd end the marriage and the friendship. How did Shelley, the great theorist of free love, react to that kind of betrayal?
And this is where his radical theory just clashes violently with raw human emotion. Despite the immense trauma Harriet suffered, she was genuinely hurt and disturbed by this. Shelley, sticking rigidly to his theories against jealousy and exclusivity, later forgives Hogg.
He forgives him.
And insists on continuing their friendship. He believed jealousy was just a destructive social construct, not natural emotion. And he refused to let it contaminate his intellectual union with Hogg. This dedication to theory over the immediate emotional reality was a recurring and, frankly, tragic flaw.
So in the middle of this domestic storm, he completely shifts gears and dives headfirst into political activism. In 1812, he and Harriet traveled to Dublin.
Why Dublin?
But why there specifically?
Dublin was a hotbed of political tension, and he went there with a mission to actively distribute 2 political tracts he had written.
An address to the Irish people and proposals for an association of philanthropists.
And he wasn't just publishing from afar. You have to picture this. He was on the street, handing out pamphlets himself.
What was the core message he was trying to push in Ireland?
It was explosive, comprehensive. He was calling for Catholic emancipation, for the repeal of the Acts of Union between Britain and Ireland, and for a direct end to the poverty and oppression of the Irish poor.
But, and this is a really crucial nuance that connects to his later nonviolence theory, he explicitly warned against a violent revolution.
He did. He stated, and I'm quoting here, "I do not wish to see things change now because it cannot be done without violence." He had learned from the chaotic aftermath of the French Revolution. He feared that violence would just lead to military despotism, which he saw as the greater long-term tyranny.
But even with those cautionary words, his public activism brought immediate, unwanted attention from the English government.
Placed under surveillance almost immediately. They had to flee Lynmouth in Devon after his 15-year-old Irish servant was arrested just for distributing his pamphlets, including this radical text called the Declaration of Rights.
So he was forced to see the real-world risk his beliefs pose, not just to himself, but to everyone around him.
Right. And yet, this period of intense political activity, it produces his first major long poem, Queen Mab, in 1813.
Was this poem just a summary of all his political ideas?
It was a privately published utopian allegory, but its real significance is in the prose notes that came with it. These notes were basically a complete revolutionary manifesto.
What do they cover?
Everything. Virulent atheism, radical republicanism, free love, and notably vegetarianism. It was a comprehensive blueprint for overthrowing the establishment socially and politically.
And publishing it in a private edition of 250 copies was a necessary shield against prosecution.
A very real and immediate risk of prosecution for seditious and religious libel.
So by 1814, that chaotic first marriage is just collapsing. He resents Harriet's sister, Eliza. He's finding emotional connection outside the marriage. But the real emotional earthquake happens when he starts visiting his intellectual idol, William Godwin, almost daily.
Shelley saw Godwin, the famous philosopher, as a kind of spiritual father, but he soon became captivated by Godwin's 16-year-old daughter, Mary.
Mary Godwin. Her mother was the late pioneering feminist philosopher, Mary Wollstonecraft. So Mary was, in a sense, radical aristocracy herself.
She absolutely was. And the famous story, the height of romantic drama, is that they declared their love for each other at her mother's gravesite.
It's just, you can't make that up.
And the drama only escalated. Shelley confessed to Godwin that he was going to leave Harriet, who was pregnant with her second child at the time, and live openly with Mary.
And Godwin, the great philosopher of free love,
was horrified by the practical reality of it. He immediately banned Shelley from his house.
But they defied him. On July 28, 1814, they fled to Europe. And they took Mary's stepsister, Claire Claremont, with them.
Claire would become another permanent fixture in their tumultuous lives. And this elopement caused immediate and devastating social fallout.
It was twofold, right? First, they were broke.
Completely. Shelley spent the next few months literally dodging debt collectors and bailiffs. Even after his grandfather died and he inherited a substantial estate, the financial settlements took over a year to process.
And second, the public scandal was just immense. Rumors were flying that Godwin, desperate for money, had basically sold his daughters to Shelley. It tarnished both their reputations permanently.
And the emotional price kept being paid. During this time, Mary gave birth prematurely to a baby girl who only lived for 10 days, and this plunged Mary into a deep, sustained depression.
This depression, combined with Shelley's continued adherence to his free love theories, led to even more bizarre and emotionally damaging situations.
Thomas Jefferson Hogg temporarily moved back into the household. It is highly likely, based on letters and later confessions from Claire, that Shelley was having a sexual relationship with Claremont at this time. And, incredibly, there is strong biographical evidence that Shelley actually encouraged a sexual relationship between Hogg and Mary as well.
Wait, he encouraged his wife to be intimate with his friend? I mean, how did that complex arrangement, this attempt to live out this lofty ideal, actually work on a day-to-day emotional level?
It was a disaster.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an absolute disaster. Shelley truly believed that open, non-exclusive affection, free of jealousy, was the ideal state. But for Mary, who was grieving her lost child, and for Harriet, who was dealing with abandonment, it just created immense emotional instability and trauma. They were trying to be hyper-rational in a deeply irrational, emotional world, and their closest relationships were the collateral damage.
This volatility then leads us to that infamous summer of 1816, the Geneva meeting with Lord Byron.
Right. Claremont, who had followed them, had already initiated a sexual relationship with Byron and was now pregnant with his child, Allegra.
The famous Diodati gathering. They rented a house near Byron's villa. They spent nights discussing literature, science, the supernatural, a peak of intellectual excitement.
But also a low point for Shelley's mental stability.
What happened?
One night, while Byron was reciting a poem by Coleridge, Shelley suffered a severe panic attack. He had vivid hallucinations, reportedly screaming about seeing a vision of Mary with eyes in her nipples.
Wow.
It just reflects the intense psychological strain he was under. Yet in that same atmosphere of intellectual ferment and psychological breakdown, Mary has the productive vision, a dream that inspires her to write Frankenstein.
The darkness of his reality was fueling her Gothic imagination.
And 1816 just ended in a series of absolute tragedies. Mary's half-sister, Fanny Imlay, committed suicide in October. Godwin believed she had been secretly in love with Shelley.
And then in December, his estranged first wife, Harriet.
Pregnant and abandoned by a new lover, she tragically drowned herself in the Serpentine River in London.
The sequence is just brutal. Harriet's death finally allowed Shelley to legally marry Mary Godwin on December 30th, 1816.
He did this primarily to legitimize their relationship in society's eyes, but strategically, it was so he could try and get custody of his 2 living children by Harriet.
But even a legal marriage didn't protect him. The Court of Chancery denied him custody of his children. What was the specific legal rationale for that?
The court cited his proven history of atheism and his abandonment of Harriet for Mary without cause. This is the ultimate proof that the state viewed his philosophical defiance, his free love theories, his atheistic publications, as disqualifying him from being a father. His refusal to conform had cost him his own children. So their social and legal standing in England is just completely destroyed. They're under this constant threat of scandal, of surveillance. So the Shelleys, along with Claire, they permanently left England in March 1818.
The necessary self-exile.
Both to escape what he called the tyranny civil and religious of Britain, and also to find a better climate for his chronic lung complaint, which was likely tuberculosis.
They arrive in Italy, and this immediately kicks off an astonishing period of creative genius. It's really the zenith of his poetic career.
But it was still framed by continuous personal tragedy. It's almost as if his genius required suffering as fuel.
That analogy is tragically apt, isn't it? Just 6 months after they arrive, September 1818, their daughter Clara dies in Venice.
This was the second child Mary had lost, and it plunged her into a long, deep period of depression and emotional estrangement from Shelley. Biographers really suggest she never fully recovered her prior affection for him after this loss.
And it is immediately after this, in Naples, that one of the most persistent and genuinely bizarre mysteries of Shelley's life happens. The case of Elena Adelaide Shelley.
Yes. In December 1818, Shelley registers the birth and baptism of a baby girl, Elena Adelaide Shelley. But he falsely names Mary as the mother.
The sheer deception of that act,
Mm.
I mean, the outright lie on official documents, it goes against his core principle of intellectual honesty.
This is the man who got expelled from Oxford for refusing to lie, and now he's putting a lie on a birth certificate. So why the deceit? And whose child was this, really?
The truth is still debated, isn't it?
It is. But the theories are dark, and they reveal the extent of the emotional void he was trying to fill. Was she adopted to console the grieving Mary? Did he believe he had a secret love child?
Biographers have floated possibilities ranging from her being his child by Claremont, or his servant Elise Foggy.
Or maybe the child of some mysterious lady he had met.
But the crucial point isn't just the parentage, it's what happened to her. Regardless of who the mother was, Shelley left Elena with Italian carers the very next day, and she died 2 years later in 1820.
Exactly. This secretive, dishonest act, followed by abandonment, it just highlights the depth of depression and emotional strain he must have been experiencing. There's a theory that this whole situation was rooted in a blackmail attempt against Shelley, which would explain the secrecy. He was desperately trying to maintain some outward appearance of order while his inner life was just fragmenting.
And despite all this chaos, despite being physically unwell, he's likely suffering from nephritis and tuberculosis. The time he spent in Rome in 1819 produced this incredible burst of creativity, the Rome trilogy.
Indeed. He begins with Julian and Medallo, which is this intensely autobiographical poem that explores his complex, almost adversarial relationship with Byron. It's a public analysis of his own personal crises.
Then came Prometheus Unbound.
A massive four-act lyrical drama. It's considered one of his definitive statements on revolutionary hope.
Let's talk about Prometheus Unbound for a moment. What's the central, enduring message of a work that takes on this myth of a titan chained to a rock?
Shelley completely repurposes the classical myth. It's a profound utopian allegory about the triumph of human benevolence over tyranny and superstition. Prometheus, who symbolizes humanity and intellect, is ultimately freed not by force, but by moral resilience and the power of love and hope.
So it's the poetic embodiment of his ideal society.
A world redeemed not by violence, but by intellectual and ethical awakening.
And then the third part of the trilogy, the Cenci, which was surprisingly a huge commercial success for him in his lifetime.
It was. It's a verse drama based on this horrific, true Renaissance story of Beatrice Cenci. It involves rape, murder, and incest. And while his other great works barely sold 250 copies, the Cencis went to 2 authorized editions.
It tapped into the public's taste for Gothic tragedy.
It did, but it also allowed Shelley to explore his consistent preoccupation, righteous rebellion against absolute, corrupt power.
But before the high of that success could really register, the personal suffering returned. In June 1819, his 3-year-old son, William, died, probably of malaria. This was the 3rd child Mary had lost.
And it was just crushing. This deepened Mary's depression to a point of near total emotional collapse. This is the period when she wrote that devastatingly bitter quote that just captures the absolute ruin of their personal life.
What was it?
"We have now lived 5 years together, and if all the events of the 5 years were blotted out, I might be happy."
Wow. That's not just grief. That is an assessment of total failure in their attempt to build an ideal life together.
And that failure, the collapse of his private utopia, seems to be the final catalyst that shifted his genius entirely back toward public prophecy. In September 1819, he gets the news of the Peterloo Massacre.
Right, in Manchester. A brutal moment of state violence. Peaceful protesters demanding parliamentary reform were attacked by cavalry, many deaths, many injuries.
Shelley was in Livorno when he heard the news, and he just channeled his profound rage and grief into The Mask of Anarchy within 2 weeks.
This political ballad is so immediate, so raw. Why was it considered so incredibly dangerous at the time?
Because it was a direct, visceral condemnation of the government. He lists key figures like Lord Castlereagh and Lord Eldon and calls them murder and hypocrisy. His friend Leigh Hunt was so terrified of being prosecuted for seditious libel that he refused to publish it until 1832, a decade after Shelley's death.
It just shows that Shelley's political poetry wasn't abstract art for him. It was criminal propaganda.
It was a weapon. And yet, in the same incredibly fraught year, 1819, he pens the Ode to the West Wind, a work that just encapsulates all his hope, his despair, and his revolutionary desire in one perfect lyrical package.
It's a masterpiece. It marries his political fire with this profound understanding of nature's cyclical power.
And when he asks the West Wind to scatter his words among mankind, and ends with that famous, unforgettable conclusion.
A wind, if winter comes, can spring be far behind.
He is talking about political revolution. He's saying that the current season of despair and state tyranny must inevitably lead to renewal. It is revolutionary hope encased in sheer beauty.
And we can't overlook Ozymandias from 1818. He wrote this short, devastating sonnet as part of a friendly competition with a friend, Horace Smith. How does this little poem capture the core of his anti-tyranny philosophy?
It captures the absolute futility of colossal power over time. A traveler finds a shattered statue in the desert. The inscription boasts, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair."
But immediately after that boast, the poem says,
Nothing beside remains.
it's brilliant. The mighty king is telling people to despair in his works, but the despair is caused by the lack of works, by the rubble and the empty sands.
Exactly. It's a timeless warning to every tyrant, every absolute government. Your power, no matter how immense now, will ultimately be reduced to sand and ruin. It's a perfect articulation of his unwavering skepticism.
As his life wound down, his creative energy just remained relentless. After the death of John Keats in 1821, whom Shelley had invited to stay with him in Pisa, Shelley wrote Adonais.
Which the critic Harold Bloom called one of the major pastoral elegies in the English language.
And just for you listening, a pastoral elegy is a formal poem mourning a friend's death, often placing them in this idealized natural setting.
And Shelley uses that form to lament Keats's death, but he quickly transforms the grief into an attack on the savage critics he believed killed Keats, and then he elevates Keats into an immortal part of nature itself. It's a powerful fusion of grief and radical social critique.
Shelley also used this time to write his most critical piece of literary theory, A Defense of Poetry, in 1821.
This essay, unpublished in his lifetime, is arguably his most crucial contribution to intellectual discourse. It contains that extraordinary, electrifying line.
Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world.
That is such a massive claim. What did he mean by that? That poets are more important than parliaments?
He argued that legislators and politicians, they just codify existing social morals and laws. But poets, by appealing to the human imagination, feeling, and creativity, they unconsciously shape the very emotional and ethical foundations upon which future laws are built.
So they plant the seeds of moral and social change long before the politicians even know a shift is happening.
It is the purest statement of his belief in the transformative political power of imaginative art.
During his final years, he moved to Pisa, forming the Pisan Circle with Byron and others. But even that intellectual community couldn't stop the personal chaos. He became intensely infatuated with Jane Williams,
Who was living nearby with her partner, Edward Williams.
and this infatuation, which led to these beautiful late lyrical poems like With the Guitar to Jane, certainly caused increasing emotional tension between Shelley and Mary. It reflected his constant spiritual quest for what he called the ideal other, an epistokeidion, a soul out of his soul.
In this intense, slightly despairing search for impossible perfection, it culminates in his final unfinished work, The Triumph of Life, in 1822.
This poem is a profound reflection on the crushing power of the conventional world fame, power, morality over the individual spirit. It's a very dark contrast to the optimism of Prometheus Unbound. Harold Bloom called it the most despairing poem he wrote.
It really shows a man defeated by the weight of personal tragedy and social rejection, just struggling to hold on to his idealism. We've seen how Shelley's life was just dictated by his principles, often at a huge personal cost. Let's really dedicate some time to his uncompromising philosophical creed, because he wasn't just a poet. He was, as you said, a philosophical combatant. He weaponized poetry to attack the social and religious foundations of the British state.
And his core identity was undeniably that of an avowed atheist. He was deeply influenced by materialist thinkers from the French Enlightenment like Holbach. For Shelley, the issue was never just about whether God existed.
No, it was political.
It was completely political. He viewed organized religion as inextricably linked to state power, aristocratic privilege, social oppression. So for him, attacking the church was attacking the state.
Which made his atheism inherently seditious in early 19th century England. We saw the legal dangers right away with his expulsion from Oxford. But what about later?
The danger was constant. His sustained attacks on the priesthood and established religion in the notes to Queen Mab were so incendiary that they resulted in 2 separate prosecutions in 1821.
Are you?
The Society for the Suppression of Vice. This was a private organization dedicated to enforcing morality, and they saw Shelley as a direct threat to public order. He was literally practicing his philosophy under the constant threat of going to prison for religious libel.
And this rejection of established religion and social conformity, it extended directly to the institution of marriage. This leads to his controversial and personally destructive advocacy of free love.
Shelley's concept of free love, and this is important, it wasn't about hedonism. It was based on the philosophical premises of Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin. It argued that human connection should be based purely on spontaneous, mutual affection.
Not on economic contracts or religious ceremony.
Exactly. He saw traditional marriage as a form of social and financial slavery that just stifled individual liberty.
Let's look at the specific language he used in the notes for Queen Mab. He didn't just criticize marriage, he tore it down. He called it a system, studiously hostile to human happiness.
He was particularly concerned with the effect it had on children. He argued that kids born into unhappy or forced marriages are nursed in a systematic school of ill humor, violence, and falsehood.
So he believed that forcing two people to stay together when the love had died just created this toxic domestic environment that perpetuated corruption and misery in the next generation.
Right. His ideal was a relationship based purely on the duration of mutual love.
Did he think this would lead to rampant promiscuity, which is what his conservative detractors were always claiming?
He absolutely denied that. He argued that if sexual connection were based purely on affection, it would lead to more stable, honest, and moral unions, because people would only engage when they felt genuine, enduring love. He thought the lack of freedom, the enforcement of unhappy unions, was what truly led to moral decay.
But, as we've already discussed, his attempts to apply this personally, the communal living, the attempted relationships between Hogg and Harriet, Hogg and Mary, it caused immense human cost and trauma. How do we reconcile the beautiful ideal with the ugly, practical fallout?
That is the central dilemma of Shelley's life. He was a radical idealist who believed human nature was perfectible and would naturally choose love and generosity if tyranny was removed, but he failed to account for the deeply ingrained psychological effects of social conditioning, jealousy, possessiveness, grief, that his theories couldn't just magically erase.
His personal life became the laboratory where his ideals were tested.
And ultimately failed. And that failure contributes directly to the despair we see in his later poetry.
Okay, let's move to the third major pillar of his creed. His development of nonviolent resistance theory, which has had this profound, long-term global influence.
His position on violence was complex. It was directly forged by his study of the French Revolution. He believed that even successful revolutionary violence was often self-defeating.
Because it just replaced one tyranny with another.
Usually a military despotism, yeah. So his preferred method was intellectual and ethical resistance.
And we saw this really early on, didn't we? An address to the Irish people in 1812 was explicit in its caution against force.
Yes, he stated clearly that no change, however good, is worth achieving if it requires force. He was arguing for a moral victory, a change of heart and mind, not a military coup.
But he wasn't a total pacifist. He seemed to make exceptions when armed force was used to suppress the national will.
That's the pragmatism in him. He conceded that insurrection was the last resort of resistance if armed force was being used to explicitly counteract the will of a nation. This is why he could simultaneously condemn Peterloo but support armed rebellions against absolute monarchies, like the uprisings in Spain in 1820 or Greece in 1821.
So he drew a line between offensive violence, which he opposed, and defensive resistance against established despotism.
Exactly. But his most enduring legacy in this area comes from The Mask of Anarchy, written right after the Peterloo Massacre.
That poem is a pure, powerful call to collective nonviolent action.
Scholars now widely consider it perhaps the first modern statement of the principle of nonviolent resistance. The poem urges the victims of state violence to refuse to fight back, to maintain their moral high ground, and to allow the state's violence to be exposed. Rely on public opinion and moral pressure.
And this doctrine connects him directly, if indirectly, to global change.
It does. While the connection is complex, it probably runs from Shelley to Henry David Thoreau's civil disobedience, and then from Thoreau to Mahatma Gandhi. The philosophical blueprint for modern civil resistance can absolutely be traced back to those powerful stanzas he wrote in response to Peterloo.
Finally, we have to touch on a key ethical component of his creed that is so surprisingly modern: his deep commitment to vegetarianism.
Shelley converted to a vegetable diet in early March 1812. He sustained it with only occasional lapses for the rest of his life. And this wasn't some trendy health kick. It was a profound philosophical stance.
Influenced by classical authors like Pythagoras, but also by contemporary proponents.
Right, like John Frank Newton. But what makes him a true pioneer is the rigor he applied to the practice, especially in his essay, A Vindication of Natural Diet.
What were his arguments? Very contemporary.
Strikingly so. Yes, he cited the spiritual and health benefits and alleviating animal suffering, the ethics of cruelty. But he also applied political and economic logic. He focused on the sheer inefficiency of agricultural land use required for animal husbandry compared to growing plants.
So he was making an early proto-environmental and economic justice argument.
Precisely. He argued that the commercialization of animal food production worsened economic inequality. It consumed resources that could otherwise feed the poor, and it ensured the land was inefficiently managed for profit, not for sustenance. For Shelley, your diet was a fundamental ethical and political issue, linked directly to the social structure.
And this was a theory that had concrete, practical results.
Absolutely. His advocacy directly inspired the founding of the Vegetarian Society in England in 1847, and it influenced the lifelong vegetarianism of major public intellectuals, including George Bernard Shaw. It just demonstrates that Shelley's radical ideas were durable. They transformed from philosophical tracts into real-world social movements decades after he died.
The life of this brilliant, frantic, and uncompromising radical came to its sudden, dramatic, and tragic end at sea. He was just 29.
On July 8, 1822, Shelley, his friend Edward Williams, and their boat boy set sail from Livorno, heading back to Lerici. They were on the Don Juan, a small, open boat that was custom-built for Shelley.
What caused the wreck? Was it just the storm, or was there something more sinister, as was rumored?
The boat was lost just a few hours later in a severe storm. And while Mary Shelley would later cling to the belief that the boat had a defect or that they were intentionally run down,
it was most likely a lethal combination of the terrible weather and the crew's poor seamanship.
Unfortunately, yes. Shelley and Williams, despite their love for sailing, were notably poor sailors.
10 days later, his badly decomposed body washed ashore near Viareggio. How was he identified?
Edward Trelawney, who organized the search, was able to identify the body from the clothing, and in a moment that just perfectly fuses the personal and the poetic, by a small volume of John Keats' Lamia found tucked into his jacket pocket.
Keats. The poet Shelley had both admired and elegized in Eton and Oxford. He was literally with him at the moment of his death.
Now we arrive at that macabre aftermath that really solidified the Shelley legend, the cremation on the beach. Why did they have to burn his body?
Strict Italian quarantine laws, right, to prevent the spread of disease.
Exactly. Bodies washed ashore often had to be cremated immediately where they were found. Trelawney arranged for the cremation on the beach near Viareggio. It was this intensely powerful, almost pagan scene witnessed by Byron and Leigh Hunt.
And this brings us to the famous, bizarre legend of the heart that refused to burn.
Yes. The story goes that Shelley's presumed heart, the organ at least, resisted the intense fire and was retrieved from the ashes by Trelawney.
There's scientific speculation about that, isn't there?
Yes, that it was either his liver or perhaps a heart that had been calcified from an earlier tubercular infection, which would make it more resistant to the flames.
So Trelawney retrieves this scorched relic. What happens to it? Does he give it to Mary?
Not right away, which caused yet another emotional battle. Trelawney initially gave the organ to Leigh Hunt, who preserved it in spirits of wine. Mary Shelley had to fight intensely for the return of her husband's remains. Hunt famously refused to relinquish it until much later.
And his ashes.
They were eventually buried in the Protestant cemetery of Rome, bearing the poignant Latin inscription, Cordium Heart of Hearts, and those evocative lines from Shakespeare's The Tempest.
Nothing of him that doth fade, but doth suffer a sea change into something rich and strange.
That imagery of sea change, of transformation, was such a powerful contrast to the immediate, brutal hostility his death was met with back in Tory England.
The establishment's hatred was just palpable.
The Tory London newspaper, The Courier, printed an editorial that summed it all up with appalling bluntness. Shelley, the writer of some infidel poetry, has been drowned. Now he knows whether there is God or no.
Wow. It just shows that even in death, he was perceived as a danger, an infidel who deserved divine retribution.
And despite that hostility and the fact that he sold poorly in his lifetime, we're talking average editions of only 250 copies, his poetry quickly gained traction posthumously.
But in very specific circles.
Crucially, yes. His work became immensely popular in radical and reformist circles. It was adopted by the Owenists, who were early British socialists, and the Chartists, who were campaigning fiercely for working-class political reform. They saw his work not as abstract literature, but as a practical political rallying cry.
But his transition into the literary mainstream, that seems to have been heavily mediated, mostly by his own wife, Mary Shelley.
That's a highly contested but widely accepted point among biographers. Mary Shelley, in her attempts to establish his reputation and ensure his survival in the conservative literary world, heavily edited his poems for publication in 1824 and again in 1839.
What was she cutting out?
She was intentionally downplaying or removing his most aggressively radical political and religious ideas. She was sanitizing his legacy. She chose to emphasize his pure, ethereal, lyrical gifts, the side of him that wrote beautiful odes over the fiery political agitator who wrote The Mask of Anarchy.
And this sanitization, in turn, shaped how subsequent generations of critics viewed him.
It absolutely did. It set the stage for much of the 20th century critical debate. Influential modernists like T.S. Eliot and F.R. Leavis, they often focused on what they saw as stylistic flaws or just found his radical ideas repellent.
Which all solidified into Matthew Arnold's famous backhanded compliment that Shelley was a beautiful and ineffectual angel.
But wait, how can someone who inspired Marx and Gandhi be described as ineffectual? Isn't that a profound misreading based on the very version of Shelley that Mary presented?
It's precisely that. Arnold's reading focuses on the lyrical, ethereal Shelley, the one detached from harsh political reality. He missed the profound, tangible influence. Fortunately, the critical tide has completely reversed since the 1960s. Modern scholarship now acknowledges his full complexity.
They celebrate him as a superb craftsman, a lyric poet without rival, and surely one of the most advanced skeptical intellects ever to write a poem. They've reintegrated the political mind with the lyrical genius.
Speaking of complex literary connections, we have to address the long-running Frankenstein controversy. Given the intense intellectual ferment and shared trauma of their lives, how much did Percy Bysshe Shelley actually influence Mary's novel?
This is a major area of scholarly contention. Some researchers, like Charles D. Robinson, have analyzed the original manuscripts and argue that Shelley's contributions, his editing, his revisions, his suggestions, were so extensive that he should be considered a genuine collaborator.
They believe he helped shape some of the novel's philosophical density.
Yes. But the opposing view argues that while he provided numerous corrections, his work was no more than what a good, high-level line editor would provide today. They argue the novel's core vision, the critique of patriarchal science, the psychological horror that remained Mary's own.
But regardless of the final percentage, it's undeniable that the intense intellectual and emotional atmosphere he created was the perfect catalyst for Frankenstein's creation.
And finally, a century after his death, you get organizations like the Keats-Shelley Memorial Association, founded in 1903. They now maintain his grave. They run the Keats-Shelley Memorial House in Rome. It's a recognition that, despite all the attempts to silence him, the profound power of the Romantic movement he helped define could not be extinguished. Hashtag outro.
Percy Bysshe Shelley packed a lifetime of rebellion into just 29 years, dying before his work was truly recognized. He is the ultimate romantic paradox, a sensitive, ethereal lyric poet obsessed with purity and beauty.
Who was simultaneously a revolutionary political agitator, a public atheist, and a social radical who suffered severe personal crises and continuous persecution for his refusal to conform.
He was forcing his world to confront ideas that were simply unthinkable at the time: nonviolent resistance, anti-clericalism, free love, proto-environmentalism, 2 centuries before they became part of the accepted discourse.
And he paid the ultimate price for that nonconformity. He lost his family, his fortune, and his social standing.
And remember the historical irony here. Shelley died believing his revolutionary poetry had ultimately failed to impact the world, mostly because so many of his core political works, like The Mask of Anarchy and A Defense of Poetry, were suppressed or unpublished in his lifetime out of fear of sedition.
But those ideas didn't just vanish. They persisted as a blueprint, later armed and deployed by revolutionary figures across the globe. The knowledge you've gained today is knowing that the fire he faced for his radicalism was the very crucible that forged the foundations of global movements.
And that raises an important final question for you, the listener, to carry forward. Shelley's most fundamental nonconformities, his atheism, his views on marriage, were seen as madness. They were cause for his expulsion and for the loss of his children. So what radical beliefs do you hold today that are persecuted, dismissed, or maybe just ridiculed by the establishment now, but may, a century from now, become the necessary foundational principles for world-changing political and ethical movements? The poet's job, after all, is to be the trumpet of a prophecy.